Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Barbell. So today's episode is going to be different from every video I've ever done on the channel. This one is essentially a podcast. So today I had Zach and Josh from Data Driven Strength on, and we talked for a little over an hour on specifically fatigue and intraset fatigue. The big thing is what we're trying to talk about is how intraset fatigue and intensity and volume and all of that kind of stuff relates to how we can get stronger most efficiently. So if you like this kind of video for the channel, make sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe. But without any further ado, we got Zach and Josh. Josh and Zach from Data Driven Strength, and we'll start off just by giving you guys a chance to talk about your backgrounds, powerlifting, the stuff that you're doing, in academia and those kind of things, and move into the rest of the discussion about really kind of the things that I feel like are clicking a lot for me at the moment. Like you guys, I followed you fairly recently on social media, and I'll encourage everybody to do the same thing. I'll have those links in the description here, but just the way that you guys are presenting information, I think has been some of the most consumable information that I think has been around as far as strength training and everything. And lots of little light bulbs and some big ones have gone off for me, just with the stuff you guys have been posting recently. So whoever wants to go first, I don't really care. You can kind of start talking about, I think y'all probably have a similar background story, but anyway, yeah, y'all let us know kind of who you are.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because me and Josh have essentially the exact same background. So me and him kind of met in undergrad at Ohio State, and both kind of lifting in the same campus gym, and started coaching a few people there, and that's kind of how we got this whole thing off the ground, and just been continuing to do it the last couple of years. And so now we're both in our master's program studying under Dr. Michael Zordos, which a lot of people know from Mass, but he's been along the game for a long time and has definitely just contributed to our overall understanding and how to communicate these topics in an effective way. So can't say enough about him. I always say I don't want to blow up his head too much because I always give him a lot of positive praise. But yeah, he's the man. So we're doing our masters right now and just trying to do our best to kind of what you said there, David, is like we try to do our best to take our academic experience and not just put out a 700 word infographic that in the reality no one reads and no one takes anything away from, but we try to take the experience in our overall understanding of the research process, break that down, distill it, and really combine it in a way that's practical, and also combine our experience as coaches to something that the everyday lifter can actually take away and apply something with very, very clear concepts. And I think a lot of people say that and aspire for that, but we really, really try to do that to the best of our ability to really communicate stuff effectively. But yeah, as far as our background, I've been doing this for a while. Josh and I met in undergrad, and just continuing to do the whole academic thing. I think both of us plan to pursue PhD, and try to take that academic thing the whole way, but also try to do the coaching thing too. So Josh, I don't know if I missed anything. You want to add anything in there?
No, like you said, we have very similar backgrounds. And Dave, thank you very much for the kind words and having us on for your first one of these in this style.
Big mistake.
I'm looking forward to
Big
test.
mistake.
But yeah, I just feel very grateful, and I know I speak for both of us in saying that having the coaching practice to inform our thought process when it comes to interpreting and thinking through research projects, as well as the reverse, right? Using that academic kind of framework and applying it to practice and the limitations of each and how they can each inform each other. I feel very grateful to have that lens going each way. But yeah, I second everything Zach said.
Has it always been powerlifting kind of stuff for you guys? Because certainly that's what got me on board with it. But I don't know what your background is. If powerlifting led you to the direction as far as the stuff you're doing with research, or kind of vice versa.
I always came from kind of the team sports side of things, and I was always a undersized, kind of typical song and dance with the athlete that didn't make it kind of thing. That's kind of where I started and really got into strength training and understanding kind of all that stuff. And I think naturally you just kind of progress to kind of strength, performance. Those are all kind of the same, and then you figure out, oh, powerlifting's a thing, that's pretty cool. And then that's just a very direct kind of way to apply the concepts that we really enjoy learning about. So it's just kind of a natural progression of kind of leading us to this kind of destination, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started coaching in a private strength and conditioning setting with team sport athletes. And then as I, started to read more research and get involved with research during my undergrad, I kind of, like Zach said, gravitated towards powerlifting just because it is so objective in nature, and it kind of, for us neurotic type individuals, it's easy to do not only from a distance setting in the sense of online coaching, but it allows you to kind of cross your T's, dot your I's, and explore every corner that you can. Again, for us neurotic types, and I think I speak for Zach and I when I say that neither of us are insane responders to training. So, kind of, we had to explore some things, and we had to again really evaluate the X's and O's, and that's what kind of led us to this more analytical side of exploring what we can gather from the research.
Sure. Yeah. Hopefully my dog doesn't get too angry at the people moving next door. But yeah, I identify like completely with what you guys said, and I think I'm coming at it a very similar way in that I don't have the same hey academic background, but like all the stuff that attracted me to powerlifting, I think like I never originally my process getting into powerlifting I think was just driven by the all the objectivity, and like you can very easily see the stuff that you're trying to do and have it show up pretty much right away, where something bodybuilding or I would imagine a lot of the other kind of sports, just other sports in general that may be a little bit more complex, tends to be harder to judge those things a little bit. So it's like my analytical mind drew me specifically, to powerlifting, and instead of like it was powerlifting first, and then that got me into the other things. So it's just cool to find people who are driven to do more academic stuff, and it's like it really connects with me. But the main thing that I guess you guys have been, and I assume a lot of the research you're doing and or studying, and just the direction that you guys are posting a lot of your stuff online, the content is about intraset fatigue, and I would say fatigue in general. I don't want to put too many words in your mouth, but that has been the stuff that has really resonated with me. Well, some of the other stuff we can touch on later about even like athlete buy-in and those kind of things that I thought have been very, very cool. That's been something I think I've put as like a high training variable for a long time, other than some of the other variables. So the main things that I want to dive into today is the relationship between intraset fatigue and then intensity and performance outcomes, and then kind of the periodization style stuff. So I think one of the first things that we'll want to try to clarify, I guess, is and it's tough because I just posted a video here recently talking about RPE and percentage based training and those kind of things, and I think a lot of times my habit is to say intensity, and a lot of times when I say intensity, I think my general terminology with that is talking about proximity to failure, but that's probably not the best way to say it, right? But I think the average person hears intensity and thinks proximity to failure. But with this, we really do need to define those things separately, don't we? Like, intensity can be something that has a high, emotional output or physical output, and maybe we can put some numbers on that going forward. But, proximity to failure might matter a whole lot more, and especially with rep ranges and velocity loss and those kind of things. So that was super vague as far as, an intro here, but I don't know where you guys want to take it.
I think I got the main gist of it, and it's essentially like you said, it's just kind of removing the concepts from one another that load or percentage of 1RM and the proximity to failure or the intensity, as you mentioned, whichever way. There's 100 different words that kind of all describe the same thing. I use absolute intensity, load to describe percentage of 1RM, but the two concepts we're really talking about percentage of 1RM and proximity to failure, or the repetitions in reserve you have for a given rep range and load. So kind of just the overarching concept of this idea that we kind of came across is that the standard force velocity curve, or that's in every single exercise science textbook, that even I think a lot of people that have zero academic or kind of formal education, that kind of stuff, know what it is. And it's essentially, if the velocity of a repetition is lower, then the force is increased. And we just kind of looked at that in our experience with this low intraset fatigue training, which I'll define here in a second, has been that training really, really slow all the time doesn't really seem to be super effective in practice. And so me and Josh both had separate experiences where we were really limiting the intraset fatigue or the velocity loss in a set, making a lot of the sets a lower RPE or a farther proximity to failure, and things went really, really well. So we're like, okay, something's going on here. Let's dig into this a little bit more. And so as you kind of concept that we started to dig into a bit more is how the intraset fatigue or the multiple reps at the given load, the closer you get to failure, how does that affect the force velocity curve? And that's kind of the concept underlying this, why this seems to be effective for strength, because at the end of the day, a 1RM is the maximal test of force production. That's like the take home thing here. It's not just that it's slow, it's why is it slow? Right. It's slow because there's additional load on your back that makes the bar slow, not that I'm doing so many reps with the given load that the proximity to failure is so close, intraset fatigue is building, and the bar is slowing down for that reason. The latter seems to, as far as the research that we kind of compiled in the article that we were talking about earlier, that doesn't seem to be a beneficial way to train for strength in the short to moderate term, and that's the key there, short to moderate term. So yeah, just overall, the concept of intraset fatigue is those sets closer to failure. That's a different reason that the bar is slowing down than the fact that the load or the absolute intensity is increasing, which is also going to slow the bar down. And just kind of dividing those two different ways of thinking about it. One is beneficial for strength adaptations, which we all know lifting heavier weights generally is going to get you better at lifting heavy weights. But the latter, training closer to failure with a given load. So let's say I use 80%, doing sets of 6 with that instead of sets of 2. That doesn't really seem to maximize the strength stimulus for that given load. And in reality, maybe staying farther from failure because the bar velocity is still high. The bumper sticker Louis Simmons quote, force times mass times acceleration. The force production of those reps is actually the highest at the beginning of the set. And that is what we kind of believe to be the reason that the majority of the strength stimulus is going to come from those first few reps and not the last ones, which is kind of counterintuitive when you're looking at the original force velocity curve. So that's all to say. Josh probably is going to point out a few things I missed here, but that's all to say the force velocity curve changes when we have intraset fatigue or as we get closer to failure. And that's kind of all the main idea is.
Yeah, I'll throw it back to you, Dave, because I think that's a really good place to start. What you just said, Zach, but just to make it very practical and very clear for whoever's watching. So let's say you have a 10 rep max load on your back for the squat, and you do a set of 10, right? An RPE 10 set of 10 reps. We're making the case that those first couple reps are the most specific to a 1 rep max because your ability to produce force is highest during those first couple reps because you haven't accumulated fatigue within a set, which we call intraset fatigue. So, reps 8, 9, 10, yes, they're slow. Yes, the velocity is similar to a 1 rep max, but they're slow because of that intraset fatigue. So, some of the listeners might be familiar with the effective reps concept where, they make the case that the reps closer to failure are more effective for hypertrophy. But this, in the case of short to moderate term strength, it's almost flipped on its head where we're saying, hey, at the given load, those first repetitions are the most specific to a 1RM and thus provide the majority of the strength stimulus for that set.
Right. Yeah. And so this is where I think a lot of the, maybe little light bulbs kind of started going off for me because when you say it that way, it's like, of course it makes sense. But I think, for a long time, a lot of the research, like if you're just looking at it on a very surface level and people are giving like clinical recommendations on how to get stronger, it's like train with more intensity, right? Mm-hmm. Train with more volume, right? Yeah. Generally, closer proximities to failure potentially can make you strong. It's like all those things are kind of there, and I don't think that you're disagreeing with any of those necessarily, right? But it's like trying to define them. And then one of the biggest things is that when we're looking at and I think all of us track velocity with our sets, and so if you do a single at 9, it's going to have a very, very low bar speed, but you're still trying to move it as fast as you can. And like that's a very important point where, you do a set of 10 to failure, those last few reps probably are much, much more similar to that single at 9 than the early reps. But the difference is the force production. And like that is, when we're trying to define specificity, where everyone's trying to go after that, I think a lot of times people are trying to like you could very easily mistake these things and look at my velocity on my heaviest squats and say, well, I need to do more reps that are similar to that velocity in order to get stronger at that velocity. We say, no, you need to do more reps with maximum output and not have the velocity decline because you were tired. So I think that's really when we're diving into this. I think the important thing is not that really high velocities are better, but it's not losing velocity in a set, right? Is really the main thing, because the specificity we're trying to maintain a single at 10 or 9.5 or whatever is a slow set, but there's very, very high force output. So we don't want to have, let's say a set of 6 at 10, right? Like that, probably that last rep for sure, but even maybe the last 2 reps are starting to be significantly slower than the early reps just because we're tired. So those become, not as specific in this case, even though they're very, very hard.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think that's the one thing that we may not have done a clear enough job in describing in like the original article that we wrote. And a lot of people were taking this to say, so you're telling me to do really fast stuff all the time. And it's like, hold on. The concept here is, again, is we're maximizing force production at a given load. So for like the volume work, that's going to be sets farther from failure on that given load. Doesn't necessarily mean low RPE, but they're usually kind of aligned. But we still think it's very, very important to practice, heavy loads that are similar to the events you're trying to get better at, which is the 1RM. And the thing to remember too, again, this is about maximizing force production. An increase in load is essentially always, is going to increase force production more than simply just staying farther from failure. I think that's a key thing to remember. So when we're talking about this concept of minimizing intraset fatigue, that's at a given load. So once we have said practically to use 75% of 1RM today, that's what I'm going to use for whatever reason you're going to do that. Then the question becomes, like Josh said, let's say that's a 10 RM set. So the maximum reps you can do with that is 10. How do we split up that work to make most of the reps maximize output or maximize force production, like you said, David? That's the question. So I think it's just important to realize that we're not saying that you shouldn't be doing heavy lifts, because, again, the technical component of strength still matters, and specificity is still going to be maximized at those weights. But logistically, we all know, if been training long enough, you can't do, theoretically, by this model, you would just do 20 singles with 95% of 1RM. We know theoretically that's probably okay, but when you try it in your gym, it's not going to happen. So let's go to the volume work. Reasonable recommendations for the percentage of 1RM we're going to use, somewhere between 70 and 85% of 1RM. So once you've decided what load you're going to use, then the question is, okay, how do we split up this work to become the most specific in terms of force production? And that's where you get the kind of idea of minimizing bar speed decline. But as you said, those reps still aren't like fast on an absolute scale. They're still pretty slow because the load's still kind of heavy. But for that given load, so for 75%, those reps are fast. So I think that's kind of the way to think about it.
Right, yeah. So we're prioritizing specificity in our ability to produce force, and not specificity in the actual bar speed there. So one of the notes that I had that I think could probably make sense to people trying to visualize this, if we have two sets that are probably still pretty difficult, like a set of 5 at a 9 RPE, or a double at a 10, or well, I'll say 9.5, right? Because at a 10 things get much slower. But so we'll say 9.5. But like with those, the double at 9.5 is a much heavier weight, but probably that second rep will have less decline than a set of 5 at a 9 or 9.5, right? So like the tough part here is that there's potentially still value, and we'll maybe circle back to this one, like a 5 at 9, even though there is some maybe more bar speed decline and those kind of things. But like just for the example that we're trying to use at this point, is that the double at 9 would have less bar speed decline but be more intense. That would probably be say more positive. That's maybe not the best way to say it, but that fits the parameters more of what we're trying to accomplish than a higher rep, very intense set. In this case, higher rep just being 5, like that's still kind of in the strength range that most people would kind of correlate to. So like if we're going to do higher rep sets, moving that at 9 closer to at 6, at 5 or something is going to be a little bit more specific to maintaining force output.
Yeah. So in your example of, a set of 5 at RP9, yes, like you mentioned, there are of course advantages to doing a hard set of 5 at RP9. One of them being, the exact joint angles that you're moving through are going to vary as the intraset fatigue accumulates. So you kind of have this movement library that you're able to draw from at later dates. So maybe
Sure.
that's an advantage. However, from the angle that we're coming from in the article and in this discussion is that those first few reps of that set of 5 are providing the best bang for your buck. So what if we did 2 triples or 2 doubles or whatever? What if we equated the number of repetitions at that load, but just broke it up into more sets? So that will maximize the total area under the curve of the force production. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then the second thing I wanted to say is I think it might be helpful to conceptualize the strength stimulus as how close the repetition was in comparison to the maximum speed you can move that repetition with no intraset fatigue. So in the case of the double at, I think you said a 9.5, that second rep, yes, it'll probably be slower, but it's not going to be as different as that last set of 5
Right.
in a set of 5 at RP9, right? So if you can kind of conceptualize it that way, that'll provide you the tools to actually apply this concept in practice.
Yeah, and that was, exactly my point, is that it's not that the set of 5 at 9 has no value, but if we're the biggest point I think at this point is trying to define the conversation as like what will get us the most short-term results, and so then the double at 9 is probably a little bit more specific, and have less intraset fatigue, and you guys have put up and the 15, where there's like the 15% velocity drop, which we haven't really talked about having specifics at this point, which I think has been positive just as far as concepts, but for people to understand how much is too much, you guys have started to define those parameters a little bit, and maybe circling back around and trying to come up with how we landed on 15% and why that number matters as far as velocity loss.
Yeah, this is a really good topic because we haven't discussed this in detail anywhere. So the one thing to keep in mind with coming up with this number that's a huge limitation is that all the literature that studies this is not repetition equated. So let's say we have a study where me and you are going to both do 3 sets at 75%. The way that they do this is we're going to tell you to stop each set at 20% of 20% velocity loss, and they're going to tell me to stop at 40% velocity loss. But the problem there is now maybe you do 9 total reps and I do 16. So one of the other kind of variables that is intertwined with this is volume. So that's one limitation. So I think purely conceptually, if we look at this again from a force production standpoint, that 15% number is just going on what we have, which again isn't volume equated research. So that's a very big limitation. But conceptually, I think it makes more sense to just try to minimize velocity decline altogether as much as possible.
Sure.
Now, this is where we kind of talk about what's theoretically optimal and then what's logistically optimal. You have 30 reps that you're supposed to complete at a given load. Theoretically optimal is to do 30 singles. Is anyone probably going to do that? Probably not. So what's kind of closer to that end as opposed to doing one set of 30? So you have on one end one set of 30 or 30 singles. Those are kind of the two configurations of the set ends of the spectrum. Let's just probably stay closer to that 30 singles end is kind of what we're getting at. So maybe 10 sets of 3 at that given load is kind of what we're getting at. So sure, that 15% number, so the velocity loss literature seems to maximize strength gains anywhere between 10 to 20%, but I still think conceptually it probably makes even more sense just at the given load and at the volume that you're doing, just try to minimize it as much as possible. That might be 15, that might be 10, that might be 5. I don't really know, and I don't think we have a good enough data to have a really hard recommendation there. I just think conceptually it makes sense to try to minimize the bar speed decay as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why I tried to ask it. As I've seen the 15% floating around, but I knew that you guys would probably have very little confidence that number is the number. And so like when I'm looking at my sets, I'm looking at and so for the people listening here, is we're talking about intraset velocity loss, meaning from the first rep that you do to the last rep, what is the velocity loss? And again, we're tracking bar speeds with these. But from my experience, if you visually see, a rep, if you're watching on camera, the first rep that you see being slower, like every rep after that is going to significantly get progressively slower, slower, slower. So, you don't necessarily need, I think it's really valuable to have the bar speed tracker, but I think a lot of times we probably do know these things a lot more clearly, just anecdotally and intrinsically. And like in the set, if you're doing it and all of a sudden you feel like, oh boy, this next one's going to be pretty hard, right? When you've already done like 3 or 4, like that's probably like, there it is. That's kind of your limit. Or with this model. So when I've been analyzing my data, I have the 15% of my head as if it's more than that, then I probably need to really like look at what's going on. But I'm looking at it as mostly just saying, okay, my first rep was 0.33, my last rep was 0.28. It's pretty close. Like, but if it's like 0.24, I'm like, we're getting kind of far away here at this point. I've lost a really good amount. I definitely need to analyze what I'm doing here, especially in the short term. So, I think with that, one of you guys were talking about training. The first thing we talked about was training really intensely, right? And that you guys started trying to pull that back a little bit. And so that kind of brings into the conversation, most of the time the common recommendation, myself included, if we're doing singles or some more difficult sets, lower rep sets, doubles or triples, or those kind of things, is basically right around the RPE 8. And I think that's kind of become just there's probably, and I was having a conversation with a client recently that the RPE 8 is a pretty good starting point, because it's going to be a difficult rep. It's going to be a high intensity proximity to failure or whatever, but that it probably doesn't. It's not intrinsically better than an RPE 9, and it's not intrinsically better than an RPE 7. But I don't know if there's anything that you guys have looked at where, like, especially if we're looking at these really low rep sets, we'll say single specifically, that there may be more value in sevens versus nines, or why eights come up so frequently, and if you guys use eights as a kind of the main RPE for singles.
So the first thing I'd say when we're discussing, once RPE is brought up into the discussion, is that I think we've alluded to this, but we're saying low intraset fatigue, not necessarily low RPE. And we're also not saying that training is going to be easy. I think a lot of people read the article or have seen some of our stuff, and this is probably a communication fault on our part, but it's not that we're advocating for easy training or, like Zach said, 50% for triples. That's, again, the most potent factor for increasing the force production is increasing the percentage of your 1RM. So you can train at RP8 and have low intraset fatigue and have as many repetitions as possible that are specific in force production to a 1RM. The next thing I'd point out when we bring RPE into the discussion is inherent limitations of RPE. Now, it kind of goes both ways in practice, in the sense that some people will, say, oh, that was an RP8, but it was really more like a 9. However, in the research, it skews the other way, and we suspect that this might also be the case in practice for a good amount of individuals, especially on your quote unquote volume work. So maybe what you're logging at an RP8 is really more like 3, 4, 5 reps in reserve. So I think it's important to remember that in RP6 and RP7, those are hard sets. So if we suggest, okay, instead of doing triples at an 8, let's break it up. Let's do slightly more sets. Let's do the same number of total repetitions, but let's do doubles, bring it down to more like an RP7. Those are still tough sets. Right. Those are, a true 3 reps in reserve set is not an easy set. So again, RPE and intraset fatigue can kind of disassociate from each other at times. Just because it's high RPE does not mean it's high intraset fatigue. So Zach, I don't know if you want to add on to that explanation.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. And I think to kind of get back to your original question, David, is at least the way I understood it, is kind of like, why is single and 8 RPE kind of the home base for everybody? Right. I think the way that I've started to kind of conceptualize kind of any question related to this. So like, should I be doing a single at 8 or a single at 7? Should I be doing a triple at a 9 or a triple at a 6? That kind of stuff. The way I've been kind of conceptualizing it based on our model is what is going to make the amount of work that you're doing the highest force production possible. So in a vacuum, that single rep that you're going up to a higher RP is going to be a higher load and thus a higher force production. So isolated, sure, you would argue for the higher RPE single. However, with certain individuals, especially depending on their personality, tons of arousal, tons of external height, they get really, really excited. And I think we've all done that before. Like if you're maxing out or something, maybe you have a couple sets afterwards, you feel terrible.
Right.
And you are considerably less snappy. Your motivation to do the volume work is going to be way less. And so the bar speeds on those sets, like Josh said, in reference to what you could do, is way less. So the force production of those sets, and so now our total for the session is probably way down. So let's say we kick the RP back to RP 7 on that single. So now we've sacrificed a little bit on that top set, which obviously has some inherent disadvantages. But let's say we were able to save a ton of that arousal, we're able to save a ton of that energy, and now all of our volume work is we're moving every single one of those reps with maximal intent. And so now the total force production in that training session is higher. And so that becomes a net positive decision. So I'm not advocating to say RP 7 is better. I'm not advocating to say RP 9 is better. What I'm saying is based on the individual's context, personality, probably even strength to some degree probably matters. And maybe limb lengths to some degree, but all those factors, what is going to result in the highest total force production for this individual? And that's how I think you make those decisions, which I think is kind of, it combines all these kind of ideas that we've been talking about into something that makes a decision a little bit cleaner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the perfect answer, and I think that's before even any of these conversations, even becoming aware of you guys, I feel like that's really been my decision making. Is I think most of us, without a super high arousal, like an RP 8, a single at 8, is going to be a difficult set, right? And take a pretty good amount of arousal. But like if you see a single at 9 or 9.5, like that's a pretty significant difference as far as how much investment that I need to put into that. And so, then kind of the same thing with like a single at 7 is I can almost sleepwalk into that, right? And even though it's still difficult, like it's going to be a challenging set, but the arousal that goes into that, I think certainly affects everything behind it, and so that is really, when I'm writing programming for people, that's probably been the governing, how much am I valuing the work behind it more so than the single itself. And so if I think somebody tends to go way too hard, get way too hyped, turn the music up really loud, sniff ammonia or something, and it's like, they're 10 weeks out from a competition and they're doing all this stuff. I'm like, maybe we need to pull back on the intensity of that single so we can maintain quality of work behind it.
And I think there's like a social conditioning component to this too. Like we're kind of joking, like single at 8 is kind of like everybody's home base. And so you kind of get desensitized to that a little bit, I feel like. So like that means something. Maybe it's 2 reps in reserve, maybe it's not. But if you see single at 7, that's easy. No matter what the actual effort is, you see a single at 6, dude, that's a warm up. Even though, like Josh said, a 4 repetition in reserve set is hard, and people don't give enough credence. But like on paper, a single at a 6, I'm not even training today. Most people view it that way. Whereas you see a single at a 9 or a 9.5. People immediately view that I'm essentially maxing out, even though that's not what it means. So I think that's something that plays into it too, is just how that psychologically is perceived.
Yeah, like, my last warm up at a competition, is not something that I'm approaching physically thinking like this is something I really need to be like fucking ready for, right? But it's 85-ish%, right? It's a heavy weight, but it doesn't take full arousal. So yes, it's and I think that's going back to the like one of the very first conversations we were having is like that is intensity, but where it's low proximity to failure by the way that we're defining these things. So I think that example is a good one for people listening to be able to understand, like intensity doesn't mean, if we're saying that it can be high intensity but low proximity to failure, like it's still a difficult experience overall. Like there's nothing else in your life that you would ever do that's like an RP 6 that you would say is easy, right? Like pick up that desk and you could only do it like 3 more times or whatever. It's like, oh, that was hard, So anything else besides would be a really difficult thing. So, but yeah, all of that, this has been like really, really clear, perfect answers. I'm really excited to be able to present this to people. I think one of the things along with that, though, is like with the force production stuff. Let's say, I'm doing 10 triples at 75%. We'll just make that up, right? The big question with this is if we're trying to maintain, the velocity force output, how light is too light at that? Because you recommend, you said earlier, it's like we're not recommending 10 triples at 50%, right? And I'm sure there's not going to be a good answer here, but is there any sort of range percentage wise or even RPE wise, whatever, that starts to maybe you start to have some pretty serious doubts that it really will contribute effectively to strength?
So just going off of the actual research we have, kind of the bottom end, it's not like we can definitively say that, below this number that I'm going to say is worse and above it is, you flip the switch and you're good to go. But generally speaking in the research, as long as it's about 65% or above, this is when we start to see those effects. So this kind of leads into the interplay of strength and hypertrophy, because our interpretation of the research is that proximity to failure is less important in terms of inducing a hypertrophy stimulus if the load is heavy enough. And our guess is that's around 70% or so, in that 65 to 75% range. So if you're getting below that 65 to 70% range and you're keeping the sets far from failure, you might be leaving some gains on the table.
Sure.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think just as like a super safe guideline for people, like the way we generally conceptualize is like if you're above an 8 to 10 RM load or so, you're probably good, and a rep's kind of a rep for hypertrophy. So the thing I like to say is like, I think this is another like conceptual question depending on the individual. Like you can get strength gains all the way down to 30% of 1 RM. It's just a question of like, once I'm operating within the constraints of whatever I deem to be effective for me, then it's like, how do we make that work more effective? So it's like, maybe there's somebody that's extremely, extremely sensitive to heavy loads and can't tolerate it very well. Theoretically, based on this model, you should use sets by 85%, let's say, but you just can't do that. So
right.
once we have the kind of constraints that kind of like Josh alluded to, like that 65 to 85% range is generally where we recommend. And I think based on experience, that's kind of tried and true. A lot of people are that volume work is going to be somewhere between that 70, 85% range. And I don't think there's any reason we need to try to shake that equation up too much. I think that's based on experience and what we have in the research. I think that's a pretty safe bet. Just in general, that 8 to 10 RM load or heavier is kind of where we like to base our decision making on. As long as you're there, you can probably organize things however makes the most sense to you. But if you're dropping below that, then the hypertrophy probably is a little bit maybe in question. Just if you need to take those sets just a little bit closer to failure than if you're training with a heavy load like Josh said.
Sure. Yeah, and so I think mostly the 8 to 10 RM and I think that's probably 75% ish, or whatever, if you're doing 10 reps, 75% somewhere in there. And so mostly that was talking about, muscle stimulation for hypertrophy and that kind of thing. But so if we're 8 to 10 rep max matters for hypertrophy, probably. But can we train further away from that if we're only thinking about strength? So like, I think you use the example of potentially like, 30 singles or something at 75%. I did the other day, I did, 8 reps. I probably could have done 10 reps with something that was calculated as like 80% of my 1 rep max, right? But so that was a high percentage, but would I still have a noticeable strength effect from doing singles at 75%, where potentially I could do 12 reps, potentially 15 reps, really going for it? How are we starting to get too far away at that point? Because I mean, really, this is probably a difficult question where like practically we would never do that. But so it's really just conceptually, how easy is too easy?
Yeah, I think my 2 cents is that, just purely going off research, the lowest we have is probably like somewhere around that 65% of 1 RM that seemed to elicit the effects that we kind of wrote about. So that's even that I'm a little bit kind of shaky. I think the main just concept though is like they're in the literature, we're documented to have 1RM gains all the way down to 30% of 1RM. So that, yes, you can get some strength gains with all those low loads. The question is, going back to kind of Dr. Zordos's terms, like what is optimal though? That's
right.
not necessarily does it work, but is it optimal? So sure, at 60, 50, 40% of 1RM, you could get strength gains. I think the kind of the overarching concept that we just keep revisiting here is once you're at a given load. So like let's say you are using 50% of 1RM. By as much as we can see, if we take hypertrophy out of the equation, so we're talking about short to moderate term strength, those first reps probably are the ones that have the highest force production and thus the greatest strength stimulus. But the lower you get on that percentage of 1RM range, I would say I'm not totally convinced that like short-term hypertrophy isn't contributing to strength. So if you're kind of looking at those adaptations concurrently, if we are training with those loads that are a little bit heavier and we're consistently stimulating hypertrophy and continuing to grow, albeit maybe a little bit less efficiently, as we'll visit here in a little bit, maybe that's still contributing to the strength progression. So that's an important caveat to make, is like you probably don't want to drop all the way down that end of that range, because we come from the background that we think hypertrophy is extremely important for strength. So it's probably important to keep some of our eggs in the basket as far as that's concerned. But the other thing to keep in mind is, although it may not be like optimal for hypertrophy if you're below that 8 to 10 RM load, I don't think we're prepared to say that you're not getting anything out of it either, because people train, that way all the time. And I think this is where the RAR accuracy conversation comes back around, is like, people will say they're training at an 8 RP with a 12 RM. I've been trying to do it on my belt squats and I'm failing miserably. Like it's hard. It's very, very hard. So I think that RM number in which you are, possibly stimulating hypertrophy, even far from failure, I think that's a little bit lower than people think. So I think, you can get something from every load, I guess is the way I kind of wrap this question up. But, it's just thinking about how do we get the most out of the load once we've selected it. So Josh, I don't know if I missed anything there.
Yeah, just really quick. I think that this question is helpful to circle back and reemphasize the point that the percentage of 1RM is the most potent factor to increase the strength stimulus due to increased force production. So by that logic, we should all be hitting 1 at 10 every single session for all of our work. But of course, that's not practical. Okay, maybe for most people, it's working in that 80% or so range, right? And accumulating low intraset fatigue sets there. However, for a certain individual, that might not be sustainable for whatever reason. So you might have to pull back in terms of your most potent dial for force production, because that's truly optimal for the individual.
Sure.
So, of course, we have what's optimal on paper, and then we have what's optimal within the constraints that the athlete is presenting with us. So if you have to go down to 70%, 65%, which we don't do frequently, we usually keep most of this strategy in the 70 to 75% or above. I think the principle still applies that if you are using 65% or even 60, the best reps for strength at that given load are the ones at the highest velocity and the ones with the least intraset fatigue. So I think that helps bring it full circle in terms of how you can apply that in practice within whatever constraints you or your client has.
Yeah. And so I think maybe for like a practical recommendation at this point, is that you could say 75%, 80% or whatever. And, I said 30 singles at that point. We changed it to 10 by 3 or whatever. But I guess, practically we would be saying that however many reps that we wanted to do, we would want to do, and not necessarily need to do, but doing as many reps at that percent of 1 rep max before we actually get, a velocity loss, right? So if it's 3 reps, if it's 4 reps, whatever, right? If we're training at 75%, there's probably not a big difference between doing 4 reps and doing 1 rep at that load if there isn't a decline in velocity. But once there starts being a decline, at that point, we should probably organize in a way we're doing more sets and less reps. Is that a good way to say that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's helpful to conceptualize it, in that sliding scale, in the sense that you could do 30 singles or 1 set of 30. From a force production standpoint, yes, the 30 singles is best, and we alluded to some of the limitations of that. But also, it's important to take a step outside of the narrow focus of just force production, which of course we're emphasizing. But for somebody like you, Dave, even if you're using 70%, walking out, unracking and walking out 30 times, that's not negligible. So that's where some of the other practical considerations come in. But yes, you're what you said is definitely correct. Just got to consider it.
Right. And so, I'm a couple weeks out from a competition at this point, and I wrote a block that was heavily trying to use a lot of these concepts and everything, and I'm really liking it. But what it turned out to be is that I'm doing significantly more sets in a day than what I had before. I think my easier squat day, I'm doing 6 sets, and my harder squat day, the first week it was like 8, including my top single. And I think on paper that's something that like I knew what I was getting into. I have more time to train. I can organize my day or whatever. But I think visually that seems daunting to people. Like if you look at it and you see, 8 doubles at 77%, and you look at that and you're like, what? Like what? Why are we training so hard? But like practically, and I've probably done something like this previously, but for sure, the last couple of weeks has been a concerted effort to do that, and I think the interesting thing, and you guys have talked about this, in your the stuff on social media and everything, is that it shouldn't, when we're programming 8 doubles at 77%, we should be moving as quickly as we can, basically, without having each set. If I'm tired going to the next set, and then because I'm tired, velocity loss happens, that kind of thing. That's too fast, right? But 8 doubles at 77%, part of it is that I should be able to do these pretty quick workouts. Actually, if it's 8 doubles at 77%, potentially could go faster than 3x5 at 7, because if I do the 3x5 at 7, I'm like sitting around for 15 minutes between sets sometimes because I'm tired, right? But I can do a set every 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, and feel pretty good, and a lot of times stay more mentally engaged and everything. And I think that's a consideration at times that people see, where they see a 10x3 or something and they think, this is impossible, I'm going to be here forever. And it's like, no, the intention is not that. The intention is we really should be, you wouldn't see 3x10 and think that's going to take forever, right? But if you flip it, it seems scary.
Yeah.
But my experience has been that I stay more mentally engaged, and a lot of times end up moving faster because of it.
100%. And that was like the main thing when we kind of get this out from like a practical perspective. She's like, people have been like, okay, yeah, I see your logic, but like no one's going to do this. Like this is just completely impractical. And I was like, well, hold on. Just the main thing here is you can auto-regulate your rest times. I think, again, the concept, we are just trying to minimize the bar speed decline for a given load that you're trying to perform. So I think as long as you're doing that, you can take, when I'm doing bench, so I just did a bench experiment recently where I was doing an absurd amount of sets per week, which was like 52 or something like that. But I did, like I said, I did top single, like 4 back off singles, 3 back off doubles, and 3 back off triples, which is, it sounds crazy on paper, but the reality is I could rest like 30 to 60 seconds between the singles because they're relatively submaximal. So like you said, David, a lot of times what I notice is that the training sessions actually went faster because you don't sit down, you're not going to DM your buddies and like get into some conversation about something that you're sitting there, oh, my rest period's now 8 minutes when I was trying to go every 4 or something like that. Like that doesn't happen because you have to stay mentally engaged, whether you use a stopwatch like that guy with a gallon jug, and you're just like going at it or whatever. But yeah, it really does. It's just a different type of focus. Like entering a set that, if you're trying to go to like a true RP8 or 9, that takes one mentality, but also a different mentality of doing, like you said, 8 doubles that are pretty heavy weight and staying on task because you have a meeting in 2 hours and you have to get your training done in a reasonable time. Like you're not going to say you only have 30 minutes to do that or something like that, but including warming up, but you can get it done in a reasonable amount of time, so long as you're on task and you auto-regulate your rest times. I think is the main concept there.
Yeah, and I think even factoring in something like anxiety or whatever, the 3x5 at 7, you do your first one and you think like, whew, that's pretty tough, right? And like I got to do that 2 more times, and then it takes a little bit to kind of talk yourself into doing it. But if you're doing 10 doubles, 12 doubles, and those are like at a 6 RP or 5 RP, whatever, it's like it's pretty easy to be like, no, I can keep going, right? And there's very little anxiety that like causes me to sit around and like have to talk myself into getting ready to go again, besides just the fact of like having to catch my breath or whatever. So yeah, that like practically, I think a lot of these things where people hear it, it sounds like when you guys are kind of recommending higher sets, lower rep ranges oftentimes, that it sounds like it would be less practical, but my experience has really not been that way at all. So yeah, I think the final thing, and you kind of just mentioned it actually, was that there's still probably some value in short-term hypertrophy, or going after short-term hypertrophy. You know, if we're trying to get strength as quickly as I can, right? So like me being 3 weeks out from a competition, it probably would be a bad idea to only write my programming in a way that has these concepts where I'm only doing 12 doubles. I'm not doing any sort of sets that try to factor in, you know, that I'm getting enough volume to try to accomplish some level of hypertrophy. So yeah, if you have any thoughts just on that concept in general, how short-term hypertrophy can potentially be programmed in like a peaking block in this case, that it would still have value for strength.
So this is kind of why we like to periodize this strategy. So the way that we tend to apply it is to use it think of it on the whole muscle level. So let's say you're doing competition squat and you're also doing belt squat. Now you can do that year round, but what we would do during a peaking block or a strength emphasis block is we can even adjust those average RPEs of the belt squat in addition to the competition squat down a little bit, because we think this is kind of a whole muscle thing. Now that isn't to say there aren't applications to, doing, this quote unquote low fatigue style on the competition movement and, pushing the RPs a little bit farther on the belt squat. But going back to that concept of, hey, if the load is heavy enough, if it's about 75% or heavier, a rep is kind of a rep for hypertrophy. So what if we just took your 3x10 on belt squats before, used a similar load, and did 6 sets of 5? We're still going to get that hypertrophy stimulus. So it's kind of, I don't want to make it all sunshine and rainbows, but it's kind of a best of both worlds type of situation, because you can get the fatigue reduction from the decrease in intraset fatigue, and you can also maintain training volume in order to continue to elicit those short-term hypertrophy adaptations, which we think should be emphasized as much as possible throughout an individual's training career, because we think that's your best bet in terms of an investment for long-term strength.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, like, I think the timeline for hypertrophy, especially as you get more advanced, is definitely debatable. So I think some people would have issue with the fact that, oh, you're not building muscle within 3 weeks of competition. I honestly don't know. I'm not going to rule it out, I guess, is the main thing. But even putting that aside, from a practical perspective, I think training volume has a ton of utility for strength outside of that too. Like the sheer number of repetitions you get to practice the skill. All of these considerations that you could, and morphological adaptations outside of hypertrophy too. There might be some things that we could speculate that contribute to that too, just doing the sheer amount of activity. But I think, like Josh said, the idea is we can kind of just keep this volume relatively stable throughout the year once we find something that's pretty effective for somebody, and then just manipulate the other variables around it to bias it towards the adaptation that we're really trying to focus on, whether that's strength in your competition or a strength test, or hypertrophy in like an off-season kind of deal when you're a little bit farther away from the strength test. But the components are generally going to be the same. Like the components of good training are going to be, relatively similar. We're going to do the competition lifts. We're going to have some accessory movements, this kind of thing. Everybody does that. It's just kind of biasing the way that looks depending on the immediate goal.
Sure. So you would probably, I don't know how confidently, but as we move away from a peaking phase, we're in a more hypertrophy driven phase. How much value do you think that there would be in kind of deprioritizing the staying away from failure? If I'm doing belt squats and I was doing 3x10 instead of 6x5, now if I did like you are doing currently at this point, let's say I'm trying to do 3x10 on belt squats at a true 8 or a 9 RPE, like fun. Yeah, so like what would be your rationale for doing that at the moment versus trying to stay a little bit further away from failure?
I think the main thing is just it's a logistical consideration is the very first thing I would say. As far as could you train low fatigue year round and maximize hypertrophy? Not sure. Maybe not. Maybe there's some mechanisms that aren't stimulated by only doing sets far from failure. We don't really know. We're confident that in the short to moderate term we can have damn near the same hypertrophy as training closer to failure. But long term, we just don't have the data to be very convinced in that. What I will say that I'm probably more in the periodization camp, as Josh mentioned. I think a few things. It gives you an opportunity to know and kind of test those proximity to failure. If you don't have a velocity device, like we're all spoiled to have one, or at least have access to one, it gives you an opportunity to kind of check your work so that when we do go into this strength phase, like we mentioned, we kind of want those loads to be somewhere above that 8 to 10 RM range. But if we never have an opportunity to kind of test what those loads are, we're kind of shooting in the dark with sets below a 5 RP. We have no idea whether that's 20 reps in reserve, 30 reps in reserve, 10. So it's kind of a chance to kind of guess and check your work, get really confident that this load is somewhere in that 8 to 10 RM range in which I can split it up however I want. But if you never have a chance to do that, you might be kind of just pissing away time with a load that isn't going to be stimulative in any way that we can be confident. So I think that's a primary consideration. And then to kind of go into the psychological piece that we talked about earlier, David, having a periodization framework that we kind of do it in this kind of polarized model where you kind of flip a switch on what you're kind of biasing towards, psychologically, that's really, really refreshing in my experience. You give somebody, okay, in this strength phase, we're really going to focus on pushing these top sets and really focusing on a load on the bar. That's really exhausting to do year round. And I'm sure you, as somebody that's way stronger than Josh and I combined, probably can identify with that a little bit. Like having to put red on red on red every single training session probably is pretty exhausting. So giving yourself an opportunity to simply focus on something different, I think can really resensitize yourself. And we've talked a ton of times how intent, motivation to train, all these kind of things, they literally contribute to the training stimulus itself. So if your motivation, if your intent, if all these things and buy-in aren't high when you move into this kind of low fatigue strength phase, it's probably going to diminish the results, but it's going to diminish the results of any training style. So I think it's just important to try to leverage that if we can. So kind of flipping between these two kind of dichotomized training style, which again, to be clear, they're not like completely different. It's just a slight shift in bias.
Right.
I think that kind of mentally resets things where you don't have to constantly focus about what was my top single, and you just give your opportunity to kind of, it's just practice. I'm just shooting free throws. Like I don't have a game coming up. I'm just practicing. A miss is a miss, whatever. But you're going in every session like I'm going to make these belt squats as stimulative to my quads as physically possible, and that's what I'm locked in about today. And it just gives you something different to focus about, and I think that is another advantage logistically that just makes the kind of the periodization framework maybe a little bit more friendly in the long run and in practice. But Josh, go ahead, and if I missed anything there.
No, I have nothing to add.
That felt like a perfect answer. I think everything that you said kind of hit home. And honestly, I hadn't even really thought about the fact that, like you said, getting your belt squat to actually be an 8 or a 9 RPE, you can get there like mentally where you don't really want to do another rep. But I know physically what I'm calling, a 7 or an 8 on my belt squat is probably more like a 1 or a 2. Like I could keep going. I just really don't want to. And so I guess it really does kind of factor into the like, okay, well, how much weight is that really, and how much stimulation am I really getting from those loads if it's not above a certain threshold. So potentially maximize. Honestly, I hadn't thought about that. So that's
and I think that probably plays into the practicality bit too, to a certain degree, because let's say you do go out tomorrow and you're going to do a belt squat set where you literally take it to an 8 RP, no matter how many reps it is. You're not doing 5 sets of those. You're probably doing 1, 2, maybe 3. And so now when you go to that strength phase, you're doing 6 sets of 5 instead of 10 sets of 5. And so it all kind of fills into one another, which I think is just another practical example of why, unfortunately, you got to take your accessories pretty serious.
I think one time in my life, I took a belt squat, like I said, a 10 to a true 9 RPE or something. And it was unbelievably, it was like, I had to check my entire, it's like, wow, I haven't been trying whatsoever on these belt squats. This was so hard. So yeah, like I think that's an interesting point, is that there is a huge difference. So actually, I said that was the last thing. Here's my little last thing, because I have this conversation with all of my lifters all the time. Hopefully this doesn't get too in depth here, but the whole conversation about intraset fatigue and everything, obviously a big part of that is trying to limit total fatigue as well, right? And we probably don't need to dive into that too much, but a big part of the concept really is that we're also trying to performance from session to session, right? that if I do these very fatiguing sets, not only are they not going to contribute as thoroughly as efficiently to my total strength or getting strength as quick as I can, but also it probably will have a more significant impact on sessions that are coming up. One of the questions that I get all the time from athletes is that they'll have, a really good day. We're doing some low fatigue style training, and then, a session coming up here pretty soon is they get a slight decline in performance, right? And sometimes they're random, sometimes they're predictable, whatever, right? And oftentimes I get athletes that are starting to, hyper awareness, and I think even this whole conversation we're talking about fatigue. I think very quickly athletes will turn and say, I don't feel fatigued. Why am I fatigued today? Or like, man, my fatigue is really catching up with me. And my feeling, what I tell people all the time is that, like, on a large scale, it's pretty abstract. Like, it's hard to nail down a lot of the factors that are influencing it. And, a decline in performance really may not be associated with fatigue on the short term. But I don't know if you guys have a brief thought on that concept right there, and maybe help me convince my athletes to stop worrying so much on their drop and saying, man, my fatigue is all out of line now.
You want to go for it, Zach?
You want me to give it a crack? I'll try my best here. Yeah, I mean, there's a few different things. Like, me and Josh have this conversation about ourselves all the time. Like, dude, squad isn't feeling good today. And like, we just had this conversation about low fatigue training and like predictability and all that kind of stuff. So we know the ins and outs of it, but like, we still fall prey to it all the time. And I think the reality is, like, it's just such a multifactorial equation that putting it solely on one thing is just probably a fool's errand. And I think the more you try to calculate it and say, well, if I fix this and this, like, it would be more predictable. Like, the reality is performance isn't predictable. And I think the sooner you can kind of be stoic in that and just realize that that's kind of the way this stuff works, I think it just benefits performance overall, because you just get less hyper anxious about one specific performance, and then you start thinking into it more. And then the training session, you have all this like external arousal. You come into the training session, you're all pent up. And then I think some of the practical factors that can lead to is you're hyper aware of your technique, and maybe you overcorrect an issue, and now your technical performance of that lift is something that screws it up. And now you're not comparing apples to apples in terms of performance from last week. Your arousal is different because the anxious state that you enter the session is like, I have to add 5 pounds. I have to add 5 pounds. That can also impact the way it's just, so there's all these things that go into the experience of you performing a set. And so the way I kind of just conceptualize it is like, the only real way we can compare apples to apples is over the long term. All this noise, just like, going back to the academic and science stuff, just with a greater sample size, these kind of little factors that we can't control for, they come out. So the more data points, the more, sessions we get to perform these sets over a longer period of time, then we can be more confident to say, okay, this is something we actually do need to fix. Where over the course of, 16 weeks, we can say, okay, what was going on here in your life, or this specific training variable that I'm consistently feeling terrible on Tuesdays. Let's take your squat volume down on Monday a little bit, or something like that. Like, over the long period of time with more data points, I think you could be more confident in those conclusions. But on the short time scale, I don't think it's worth worrying about too much, because the reality is you're not able to compare apples to apples. So saying that performance is lower, I don't really think is a fair conclusion to make, because it's really not the same exact thing you're comparing. So.
Yeah, and I think that further emphasizes why we like to periodize the strategy, because if we are implementing a low fatigue style, the way that this is often framed is to maximize top end strength performance. However, if we can take periods of time in which the focus is on nailing an RP8 on your belt squat or on your accessories, that can help the athlete to disassociate from the performance. So I think from a practical perspective, the biggest thing is just finding a way to get that individual to disassociate from that performance. Because at the end of the day, the year-round top sets, yes, we want to see the general trend to be upwards, of course. However, if you get too caught up in the noise, that's going to be a net negative. And really, all we're trying to do is just get a high force production repetition that is slow because the weight is heavy, not because it's the last set of a 10 rep max. It's really just practice. So if we could frame that as practice, and then, okay, now the real work is happening after that, and just find a way to disassociate, whether that's through conversation or through different programming tactics, I think is the key there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's what you guys said about it just being impossible to judge, on a really short-term basis like that. And I think, going into the kind of the next factor would be the more that people focus on it, it tends to snowball even bigger, right? Like if you have one bad session, you start thinking like, maybe I'm fatigued. And then you go in thinking like, last session wasn't bad. Is it still because I'm fatigued? And then like you kind of start getting that sticking with you, and it becomes more anxiety and all those kind of things together, where really we should just say like, wasn't that good today, right? I'll analyze it next time, and hopefully it's just a little blip on the radar and we don't even think about it whatsoever. But the more we start getting those blips, the more we start thinking like, what is that? Why is that happening?
I think that's why progress seems to be so streaky sometimes, because in the same sense that, oh, I had a bad performance, now you're looking for it. Oh, is that fatigue monster still on my back? You get in that, it's a positive feedback loop, but the results are negative, right? It's not a place you want to be. But on the other hand, you can get that same feedback loop, but the results are positive, right? Things are feeling good, expectations are high. I think that just goes to show, yes, we can talk about low fatigue training and force production all day long, but at the end of the day, if you're not managing expectations properly, and you're just in this constant feedback loop of negative expectations and over analyzing, performance on a week to week or any short term basis, that's just as important as perfectly optimizing your training program to maximize force production.
Yeah, and I think you guys have started posting about how you guys use intro weeks into training a lot of times, and I do that, probably not as I don't write it so much, on paper where it's clearly different, but I'm definitely encouraging my athletes to say like, this is week one, right? Like I don't need you, if that RPE 8's a little bit whatever, like let's keep it easy, right? And I think the main thing there is not that I would say physically that it's more optimal to go, a little bit easier, but I would say one of my major considerations is that mentally, at that point, people, if we can start them off at kind of a lighter loading and give them the opportunity to start building that momentum from week to week, that it just increases all that positivity, and maybe there are some physical benefits as well, but just trying to manage the expectations tends to lead to more success at the end of blocks, more so than starting them off with a certain number, and then it's like, well, I didn't improve on week 2, I didn't, and like I feel stagnant, I guess I'm just stagnant now, I guess my fatigue is too high. It's like, well, we can artificially make that happen too. Well, yeah, guys, I think that's everything that I have for you. This was super insightful. I really appreciate you guys doing it. So if you guys want to let people know where they can find you, I'll put your information here in the YouTube video below, so they'll be able to find you on Instagram and everything. But anything else you guys want to tell people what to look out for, let them know.
Go for it, JP.
Yeah. So if you're interested in looking through, some of the research that we draw from to come to these ideas, as well as kind of laying out the groundwork for all this stuff, we have an article on myojournal.com, which is Brian Miner's website. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. Our website is data-drivenstrength.com. We have a couple other articles on there. And then my Instagram is at josh.datadrivenstrength, and Zach's is at zach.datadrivenstrength. And I think we're starting a podcast. We did one of them. We'll see if that continues. So you can check us out there. We may or may not be on Apple Podcasts. I think we're on YouTube.
We are.
So
we're on Apple.
If you go to Instagram, you can find us.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, guys, just want to reiterate, dude. Thank you so much for having us. Had a great time.
This was a really good chat for me. Yeah, thanks a lot. So hopefully we'll talk soon. And this was really insightful. And as you guys get more and more information, maybe we'll do another one and we can get even more complex and confusing and everything.
Awesome, man.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.